I was folding laundry in my kitchen on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring. Nothing unusual about that, you might think. But when I opened that door and saw the face of a ghost, a man I had buried in my heart many years ago, my entire world shattered into a million pieces. The basket of clean clothes fell from my trembling hands, and all I could whisper was his name, James. What would you do if the love of your life, the man you mourned for decades, suddenly appeared at your door, very much alive, while your husband of 15 years was upstairs taking his afternoon nap and your children were playing in the backyard? What would you do if you had to choose between the greatest love of your youth and the family you built from the ashes of that loss? Hello, my dear friends. I'm Catherine. Before we dive into this story that changed everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please tell me in the comments which country or city you're from. And if you enjoy stories about life's most unexpected twists, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to stick around for this one. I promise you that. Let me take you back to where it all began, in 1943, when I was young, and the world was at war. I was working as a nurse at the military hospital in Boston, spending my days caring for wounded soldiers who arrived from the European front. It was demanding work, both physically and emotionally, but I felt like I was making a difference. One bandage and one kind word at a time. The hospital corridors always smelled of antiseptic and hope mixed with desperation. Every day brought new faces, young men barely older than me, carrying wounds that went far deeper than what we could see on the surface. Some would recover and return to their units. Others would go home, permanently changed. And sadly, some wouldn't go anywhere at all. It was on a particularly busy Thursday morning in March when they brought him in. James Mitchell. I remember the date exactly because it was the day my entire life took a turn I never saw coming. He had taken shrapnel to his left shoulder and had a nasty gash on his forehead. But what struck me immediately wasn't his injuries. It was his eyes. Even through the pain and exhaustion, they sparkled with this incredible warmth and mischief that seemed completely out of place in a war hospital. As I cleaned his wounds, he kept trying to make me laugh. "Nurse," he said with a grin that made my heart skip. "I have to tell you, getting shot wasn't on my to-do list for this week, but meeting an angel like you might just make it worth it." I tried to maintain my professional composure, but Lord help me, I actually giggled. Me, Catherine Williams, the most serious and dedicated nurse on the ward, giggling like a schoolgirl. "That's a terrible line, soldier," I replied, trying to sound stern while applying iodine to his cut. He winced but never stopped smiling. "Maybe so," he said. "But it got you to smile, didn't it? That's got to count for something in this gloomy place." Over the next 2 weeks, as James recovered, our conversations became the highlight of my shifts. He told me about his hometown in Ohio, about the farm where he grew up, about his dreams of becoming a teacher after the war. I shared stories about my nursing training, my family, my love for books and music. He had this way of listening, really listening, that made me feel like every word I said mattered. James had a gift for finding humor in the darkest situations. When old Mr. Henderson in the next bed complained about the food for the 100th time, James would whisper to me, "I think Mr. Henderson believes complaining is his contribution to the war effort." When another patient groaned about his physical therapy, James would say, "At least they're not shooting at you while you're exercising, buddy. Trust me, it makes a difference." But it wasn't just his humor that drew me in. There was a depth to him, a gentleness in how he treated the other patients, especially the ones who were struggling mentally with what they'd seen overseas. He would spend hours talking to them, sharing his own fears and doubts, never pretending to be braver than he was. I watched him comfort a young soldier who couldn't stop shaking from shell shock, just sitting beside him in silence, when words weren't enough. The night before James was discharged back to active duty, he asked me to take a walk with him in the hospital garden. It was a beautiful April evening, with cherry blossoms blooming despite the war raging across the ocean. We sat on a wooden bench under the pink petals, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed nervous. "Catherine," he said, taking my hand in his calloused one, "I know we haven't known each other long, and I know the world's gone crazy right now, but I need to tell you something." His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I fell the moment you rolled your eyes at my terrible pickup line and then smiled anyway." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "James, I know it's complicated," he continued quickly. "I know I might not come back from wherever they're sending me next. I know it's not fair to ask you to wait or to care about someone who might not have a future. But I had to tell you, because if something happens to me over there, I want to know that for once in my life I was completely honest about what mattered most." I looked into those warm, sincere eyes and felt something I'd never experienced before. It wasn't just attraction or infatuation. It was recognition, like my soul had found its missing piece. "You're not falling alone, James Mitchell," I whispered. "I'm right there with you." We kissed under those cherry blossoms while the world burned around us, and I knew with absolute certainty that this man would change my life forever. I just had no idea how many different ways that would turn out to be true. The question that would haunt me for decades was simple. How do you hold on to love when everything around you is designed to tear it apart? James was granted a 2-week medical leave before being reassigned to a new unit, and those 14 days became the most intense and magical period of my entire life. We were both acutely aware that time was our enemy, that every moment together was borrowed from an uncertain future, so we loved with an urgency that took my breath away. Our first official date was to a small jazz club downtown. I had never been to such a place before. My upbringing had been quite conservative, but James had this way of making everything feel like an adventure. "Come on, Kathy," he said, using the nickname that made my heart flutter. Life's too short to always play it safe, especially now. He was right, of course. When young men were dying overseas every day, when tomorrow wasn't guaranteed for anyone, playing it safe seemed almost silly. The club was dimly lit with candles on small round tables, and a Negro quartet played music that made my soul dance, even while sitting still. James ordered us both whiskey, which I had never tried before, and when I coughed after the first sip, he laughed so hard that other couples turned to look at us. "Not quite like your Sunday tea, is it, nurse?" he teased, and I playfully swatted his arm. "Hush, you! I'm a quick learner." By our third date, we were talking about everything and nothing, finishing each other's sentences, finding excuses to touch hands across restaurant tables. James had this habit of tucking a strand of my hair behind my ear when I got excited about something I was saying, and every time he did it, I felt electricity shoot through my entire body. I remember one afternoon we spent at the park, lying on a blanket under an old oak tree, sharing a basket of sandwiches I had packed. James was telling me about his childhood dog, Rusty, when suddenly he went quiet. "What is it?" I asked, propping myself up on my elbow to look at him. He was staring at me with such intensity that I felt like he was trying to memorize every detail of my face. "I just realized something," he said softly. "I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life, however long or short that life might be." My breath caught in my throat. We had only known each other for 3 weeks, but it felt like a lifetime. More importantly, it felt like not nearly enough time at all. "James," I whispered, suddenly understanding where this was leading, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" He sat up abruptly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the most beautiful ring I had ever seen. It wasn't large or expensive, just a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight and threw tiny rainbows across my fingers when he slipped it on. "Catherine Williams," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife even though I can't promise you anything, except that I will love you with every breath I have left?" I should have been practical. I should have said we needed more time, that we barely knew each other, that wartime romances were notoriously complicated. Instead, I threw my arms around his neck and whispered, "Yes," against his ear, feeling like my heart might actually burst from happiness. We decided to marry immediately. There was no point waiting when James would be shipping out again in just 10 days. My mother nearly fainted when I called to tell her. "Catherine Marie Williams, have you lost your mind? You can't marry a man you've known for 3 weeks." But my father, bless his heart, understood. He had served in the Great War and knew that love couldn't wait for convenient timing during wartime. The wedding ceremony was small but perfect. We held it at the little chapel near the hospital, with just my parents, James's mother who took the train up from Ohio, and a handful of friends from the hospital. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered quickly by Mrs. Patterson, who lived next door and was handy with a needle. James looked so handsome in his dress uniform, standing at the altar with tears in his eyes, as I walked down the aisle to Ave Maria, sung by my childhood friend Martha. When the chaplain asked if he took me to be his wife, James's voice cracked as he said, "I do, with all my heart and soul." When it was my turn, I looked into his eyes and said, "I do, for however long God gives us." Our first kiss as husband and wife was gentle and reverent. But when we pulled apart, James whispered in my ear, "Hello, Mrs. Mitchell," and I nearly dissolved into a puddle of pure joy, right there in front of everyone. The reception was held in the church basement, with cake that my mother had somehow managed to make despite sugar rationing, and dancing to music from James's portable radio. I'll never forget our first dance as married couple, swaying to "I'll Be Seeing You," while everyone we loved watched with tears in their eyes. Even crusty old Dr. Morrison from the hospital dabbed at his eyes with his handkerchief. We spent our wedding night at a small hotel downtown, and I won't go into details, but I will say that James was as gentle and loving as I had imagined he would be. We stayed up all night talking about our future, about the house we would buy after the war, about the children we wanted to have, about growing old together on his family's farm in Ohio. "I want at least 3 children," James said, tracing patterns on my bare shoulder as we lay entwined in the early morning light. "2 boys and a girl. The girl has to look exactly like you." I laughed and kissed his chest. "What if we have 3 girls? Then I'll be the luckiest man alive," he replied, "because that means 3 little versions of the woman I adore." Those remaining days of our honeymoon were like living in a beautiful dream. We pretended that the war didn't exist, that James wasn't leaving, that we had all the time in the world. We took long walks through Boston Common, had romantic dinners at tiny restaurants, went to movies where we whispered silly comments to each other and got shushed by other patrons. James bought me a small gold locket for my birthday, which fell during our honeymoon week. Inside, he placed a tiny photograph of himself in uniform. "So you'll always have me close to your heart," he said as he fastened it around my neck. I still have that locket, 78 years later. I've worn it every single day since, but even in our happiness, reality kept creeping in. James would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night from dreams about combat, reaching for me to make sure I was still there, and I would catch myself memorizing the sound of his laugh, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he first woke up, the exact shade of blue in his eyes. On our last morning together, we made love, slowly and tenderly, both of us crying, but trying not to let the other see. Afterward, as James packed his few belongings, I helped him fold his uniforms with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "This isn't goodbye," he said firmly, taking my face in his hands. "This is see you soon. Say it, Kathy. Say, see you soon. See you soon," I whispered, though the words felt like glass in my throat. At the train station, surrounded by dozens of other couples facing the same heartbreak, James held me so tightly I could barely breathe. "I love you, Mrs. Mitchell," he said against my hair. "I love you more than I ever knew it was possible to love someone. You are my heart, my soul, my everything, and I promise you, I will come back. Nothing, and I mean nothing, will keep me from coming back to you." The train whistle blew, and I had to let him go. How could I have known that sometimes the most sincere promises are the hardest ones to keep? After James left for Europe, letters became my lifeline to sanity. I lived for the sight of that familiar handwriting on envelopes that traveled thousands of miles to reach my trembling hands. The postal service became my religion, and our mailman, Mr. Peterson, became something of a saint in my eyes. James's first letter arrived exactly 1 week after his departure, and I clutched it to my chest before even opening it, trying to absorb whatever essence of him might still cling to the paper. His handwriting was hurried but careful, and I could picture him writing by lamplight in some makeshift camp. "My dearest Kathy," it began, "I've been gone only 6 days, and already I miss you so much it physically hurts. I keep reaching for you in my sleep and waking up disappointed. The guys in my unit think I'm crazy because I kiss your photograph goodnight every evening, but I don't care. Let them think what they want. I'm crazy about my wife, and that's something to be proud of." He wrote about the ship crossing, about his new unit members, about the food that was somehow both flavorless and terrible at the same time. But mostly he wrote about us. "I think about our wedding night every single day," one paragraph read, making me blush even alone in my bedroom. "I think about the way you laughed when I tried to unbutton your dress and got nervous and clumsy. I think about how beautiful you looked in the morning light, and how you made me feel like the luckiest man who ever lived. I carry that memory with me into every difficult moment over here." My letters back to him were equally intimate and longing. I told him about my days at the hospital, about the patients who reminded me of him, about how I had moved back in with my parents temporarily to save money, and because the apartment felt too empty without him. "I sleep on your side of our bed," I wrote, "because it still smells like your aftershave, and it helps me pretend you're just in the bathroom and will be back any minute." As weeks turned into months, our correspondence developed its own rhythm and language. James would number his letters so I'd know if any were lost in transit, and he'd always end with, "Until I can hold you again, I remain completely and utterly yours, James." I would respond with updates about our savings account, about the house hunting I was doing in preparation for his return, about baby names I was considering for our future children. The letters also revealed sides of James that our whirlwind courtship hadn't allowed time to discover. He wrote beautifully about the European countryside he was marching through, despite the circumstances. "Even in war, Kathy, there's beauty if you look for it. Yesterday we passed through a small French village, and an old woman came out of her bombed house, carrying a pot of soup to share with us. She had lost everything, but she still wanted to feed hungry soldiers. It reminded me of your generous heart." He also shared his fears, something I don't think he would have done face to face. "Some nights I'm so scared I can barely breathe," he admitted in one particularly honest letter. "Not scared of dying exactly, but scared of never seeing you again, scared of never building that life we planned, scared that this war will change me so much that you won't recognize the man who comes home to you. Promise me, Kathy, that no matter what happens, You'll remember the man who danced with you in that church basement." I wrote back immediately, reassuring him that love didn't work that way, that the man I fell in love with was still there inside him, no matter what the war demanded of him. "You could come home with purple hair and 3 arms, and I would still love you exactly the same," I teased, trying to make him laugh. "Though I might need you to explain the extra arm situation." The letters came regularly for 8 months. Sometimes I'd receive 2 in one day. Sometimes I'd go a week without hearing anything, and would pace the floors until Mr. Peterson appeared with that blessed envelope. My mother would watch me with worried eyes as I devoured each letter multiple times, memorizing every word. Then came the letter that would haunt me forever. It arrived on a Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year after we'd first met. The envelope looked different somehow, more official, and James's handwriting seemed hurried, almost frantic. "My darling wife," it began. "I don't have much time to write this. We're moving out in an hour for what they're telling us is a major operation. I can't say where. You know how strict they are about that. But I wanted to get one more letter to you before we go." He went on to describe a dream he'd had about me the night before, about us sitting on the porch of our future home, watching our children play in the yard. It was so real, Kathy. I could hear your laugh, could smell your perfume. When I woke up, I knew it wasn't just a dream. It was a promise of what we're going to have together. The letter continued, more romantic and passionate than any he'd written before. "If something happens to me in the next few days, I need you to know that loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You made me a better man, a braver soldier, a person worth saving. Don't you dare feel guilty if I don't make it back. You hear me? You gave me more happiness in our short time together than most men get in a lifetime." But then came the part that gave me chills. "I've written another letter, one that I hope you'll never have to read. I've given it to my buddy Frank with instructions to send it only if I can't send it myself. But I don't think that's going to happen, sweetheart. I have too much to live for, too much waiting for me at home. I'm coming back to you, Catherine Mitchell. Count on it." He signed that letter differently than all the others. Instead of his usual closing, he simply wrote, "Forever and always yours, no matter what, James." I must have read that letter 50 times, trying to decode some hidden message, some clue about what he was walking into. The tone felt final, in a way that terrified me, like he was saying goodbye, even while insisting he'd return. But you know what the most heartbreaking part is? Even after all these years, I remember exactly what I was doing when I realized that Tuesday letter would be the last one I ever received from my husband. Before I tell you about the silence that followed, I want to pause for a moment. If you're enjoying Catherine's story so far, please subscribe to our channel. These stories of love, loss, and resilience deserve to be shared, and your subscription helps more people find them. Also, I'm curious what you think about James's final letter. Do you think he had a premonition something might happen, or was he just being cautious? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. 3 weeks passed without a word, then 4 weeks, then 6. I wrote letter after letter, but none came back. The silence was deafening, more terrifying than any bad news could have been. At least bad news would have been definitive. This silence left room for hope, and hope, as I learned, can be the cruelest emotion of all. I started having nightmares about that last letter, about the words, "If something happens to me." I would wake up in cold sweats, reaching for letters that weren't there, listening for a mailman who had nothing to deliver. My mother tried to comfort me. "No news is good news, dear," she would say. "If something had happened, they would have told you by now." But deep in my heart, I knew better. The silence wasn't protecting me from bad news. The silence was the bad news. What do you do when the person who completes your soul simply vanishes into thin air, leaving nothing but memories and the echo of promises that now seemed impossible to keep? The official telegram arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday morning in May, exactly 2 months after James's last letter. I remember the weather so clearly because it felt like the sky was crying for me when I couldn't seem to cry anymore. I had cried so much during those weeks of silence that I thought I had no tears left. I was wrong. Mr. Peterson, our mailman, knocked on our front door instead of just leaving the telegram in the mailbox. His face was pale, and his hand shook as he handed me the yellow envelope. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I'm so very sorry." He had delivered enough of these during the war to know what they contained. My hands trembled so violently, I could barely tear open the envelope. The words swam before my eyes. "The War Department regrets to inform you that your husband, Sergeant James Mitchell, has been reported killed in action in France on March 15th, 1944. The date was 3 days after his final letter to me. I remember sinking to my knees right there on the front porch, the telegram fluttering from my fingers like a wounded bird. My mother rushed outside when she heard my wails, and she held me while I sobbed until I thought I might die from the sheer physical pain of heartbreak. It felt like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my heart while it was still beating. The funeral was surreal because there was no body to bury. We held a memorial service at the same chapel where James and I had been married just 10 months earlier. Seeing our wedding flowers replaced by funeral wreaths felt like some kind of cosmic, cruel joke. The chaplain spoke about sacrifice and honor and eternal love, but all I could think about was that James would never come home to build the life we had planned. I wore black for a full year, as was proper for widows in those days. But the external mourning felt inadequate compared to the darkness that had settled over my soul. I continued working at the hospital because I needed the distraction, but everything reminded me of James. Every wounded soldier who came through those doors could have been him. Every love letter I helped illiterate patients write to their sweethearts was a letter James would never write to me. Sleep became my enemy. In dreams, James was still alive, still writing to me, still coming home. I would wake up reaching for him, calling his name, only to remember all over again that he was gone. Those moments of waking were like experiencing his death fresh each day, a wound that reopened every morning at dawn. My parents worried about me constantly. My mother would find me talking to James's photograph or holding his letters, reading them over and over until the paper wore thin from my fingerprints. "Catherine, dear," she would say gently, "you're still so young. James wouldn't want you to stop living." But I couldn't imagine loving anyone else. The very idea felt like betrayal. 2 years passed in this gray existence. I was functioning, but not living, surviving, but not thriving. I had moved back into my childhood bedroom permanently, unable to face the apartment James and I had briefly shared. I kept our wedding rings in a small box beside my bed, taking them out sometimes just to hold them, remembering how happy we had been when we picked them out together. It was during my 3rd year of widowhood that Dr. Robert Harrison joined the staff at our hospital. He was a widower himself, having lost his wife to tuberculosis 2 years prior, and he understood grief in a way that others couldn't. Robert was different from James in every possible way. Where James had been spontaneous and full of laughter, Robert was steady and thoughtful. Where James had swept me off my feet with passionate romance, Robert offered quiet comfort and gentle friendship. At first, our relationship was purely professional. Robert was an excellent physician, dedicated to his patients, and he treated the nursing staff with respect and kindness that wasn't always common in those days. He never made inappropriate advances or comments, never made me feel uncomfortable. Instead, he would ask thoughtful questions about patient care, listen to my suggestions, and actually implement my recommendations when they made sense. Gradually, we began having conversations that went beyond medical matters. During rare, quiet moments in the hospital, Robert would ask about my day, my thoughts on current events, my opinions on books we had both read. He had a dry sense of humor that was completely different from James's playful wit. But it made me smile, in spite of myself. When I mentioned that I missed going to the movies, he casually suggested that perhaps we could attend a matinee, showing together sometime. As friends, of course. That first friendly outing to see Casablanca was awkward and wonderful and heartbreaking all at once. Sitting in the dark theater next to Robert, I felt guilty for enjoying his company. When Ingrid Bergman's character had to choose between two men she loved, I felt like the movie was speaking directly to my situation, except my choice had been made for me by cruel circumstances. After the movie, Robert walked me to the bus stop, and we talked about the film's themes of love and sacrifice. "It's interesting," he said thoughtfully, "how love doesn't always follow the rules we think it should. Sometimes loving someone means letting them go, and sometimes it means holding on despite everything." I knew he was talking about more than just the movie. Our friendship developed slowly, carefully, like two people who had both learned that happiness could be snatched away without warning. Robert never pressured me for more than I was ready to give. He never asked me to stop wearing James's locket or to put away his photograph. Instead, he made space for my grief within our growing relationship, understanding that loving me meant accepting that part of my heart would always belong to someone else. "I'm not trying to replace him, Catherine," Robert told me one evening as we sat on my parents' front porch swing. "I couldn't even if I wanted to. But maybe there's room in your heart for a different kind of love. A quieter kind, but no less real." His honesty and gentleness broke down my defenses in a way that passion never could have. It took me 4 years to say yes when Robert finally proposed. By then, I had been a widow longer than I had been a wife. The proposal itself was perfectly Robert, practical, considerate, and surprisingly romantic in its sincerity. "Catherine," he said, "I know I'm not your first love, and I'm at peace with that. But I would be honored to be your last love, if you'll have me." We married in a small ceremony at the courthouse with just immediate family present. I wore a simple blue dress instead of white, and I kept James's locket on under my new wedding outfit. Robert noticed, of course, but he simply kissed my forehead and whispered, "He's still part of you, and therefore part of us." Our marriage was different from what I had shared with James, but it was beautiful in its own way. Robert and I built our relationship on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep appreciation for the second chance we had both been given. We bought a small house with a garden where I could grow the flowers James had always promised to plant for me. And Robert never questioned why I sometimes got sad in March, around the anniversary of James's death. Our first child, Margaret, was born in 1949, exactly 5 years after I received that devastating telegram. Holding her tiny body against my chest, I felt something inside me heal that I didn't even realize was still broken. She had Robert's serious brown eyes and my stubborn chin, and when she wrapped her perfect little fingers around mine, I knew that love really could bloom again, even in the most devastated soil. Thomas followed 2 years later, a robust boy who inherited his father's patience and his mother's determination. Watching Robert with our children, seeing him read bedtime stories, and tend to scrape knees with the same gentle care he showed his patients, I fell in love with him all over again. It wasn't the lightning strike passion I had felt for James, but it was solid and warm and reliable, like a fire that would burn steadily for decades. Still, I never forgot my first husband. On quiet evenings when Robert was reading his medical journals and the children were asleep, I would sometimes take out James's letters and read them again. Robert knew about these moments, and he never interrupted them. He understood that remembering James wasn't about loving him less. It was about honoring the part of my story that had made me who I was. The children grew up knowing they had a first daddy who had died in the war before they were born. I showed them James's photograph and told them stories about his kindness and humor. "He would have loved you both so much," I would tell them. And I meant it. Margaret especially seemed fascinated by these stories, often asking me to tell her again about how James and I met, how he made me laugh even when he was wounded. As the years passed, my grief for James transformed from sharp, cutting pain into something softer, but no less profound. It became part of the landscape of my heart, like a beautiful but melancholy song that played quietly in the background of my happiness with Robert and our children. Some nights I would dream about James, and in those dreams, he was always proud of the life I had built, always encouraging me to embrace the love I had found with Robert. By 1960, 16 years after that terrible telegram, I had settled into what I thought was my permanent life story. I was Catherine Harrison, mother of 2, wife of a respected physician, pillar of our church community, woman who had loved and lost and loved again. I had learned that the human heart is more resilient than we ever imagine, capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously: grief and joy, remembrance and hope, endings and new beginnings. I thought I knew how my story ended. I thought the chapter with James Mitchell had been closed forever, filed away in the first love section of my memory, where it would remain beautiful but distant, like looking at old photographs of a life that once was, but could never be, again. I was living peacefully with my memories, my family, and my hard-won wisdom about love's ability to surprise us. Robert and I had found our rhythm, our comfortable partnership, our quiet contentment. The children were thriving, our community respected us, and I had finally made peace with the idea that some loves are meant to burn, bright and brief, like shooting stars that illuminate the sky for just a moment before disappearing forever. But as I stood in my kitchen on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1964, folding laundry while my husband napped and my children played in the backyard, I had no idea that shooting stars sometimes circle back. I had no idea that some stories refuse to end when we think they should, that some loves are too powerful to stay buried, even by war, even by time, even by so many years of carefully constructed new happiness. The doorbell was about to ring, and everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and the final nature of endings was about to be proven devastatingly, beautifully wrong. How do you prepare for a miracle that feels like a catastrophe? How do you reconcile a resurrection with the life you've built in its absence? The doorbell rang at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember the precise time because I glanced at the kitchen clock, annoyed at being interrupted during the peaceful quiet of nap time and homework hour. Robert had just dozed off in his reading chair after a long morning at the hospital, and the children were in the backyard building what Margaret called the greatest fort in the history of forts, while Thomas tried to convince her that they needed more structural support. I was folding Robert's shirts, the familiar domestic rhythm soothing me as it always did. There's something meditative about the simple act of smoothing wrinkles, matching sleeve to sleeve, creating order from chaos. I had just picked up one of Thomas's school shirts, noting how much he'd grown this year, when that doorbell shattered my peaceful afternoon. I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothed my hair, and walked to the front door, expecting perhaps a neighbor needing to borrow something, or maybe the postman with a package too large for the mailbox. Mrs. Henderson from next door had been talking about a new recipe she wanted to try, and I thought she might be coming to ask for some sugar or vanilla extract. I certainly wasn't expecting my life to explode into a million pieces the moment I turned that brass doorknob. But there he stood, weathered by experiences I couldn't imagine, his dark hair now streaked with premature silver, and his face marked by lines that spoke of suffering I had never seen before. He was thinner than I remembered, his frame carrying the kind of leanness that comes from hardship rather than choice. His clothes were simple but clean. A plain white shirt, dark trousers, a worn brown jacket that had seen better days. But those eyes, those impossibly blue eyes that had haunted my dreams for 2 decades, were unmistakably, undeniably James's. For a moment that felt like an eternity, we simply stared at each other across the threshold. I felt like I was looking at a ghost, a figment of my imagination born from too many years of wishful thinking and unresolved grief. My hand flew to my throat, instinctively touching the locket that still hung there after all these years, the locket that held his photograph, a photograph of a younger man, unmarked by the suffering I could now see, etched in the face before me. "Hello, Catherine," he said, and his voice was exactly the same, that warm baritone that used to whisper sweet nothings in my ear during our brief honeymoon. But there was something different in his tone now, a hesitancy that hadn't been there before, a careful quality as if he was unsure of his right to speak to me at all. "I know this is impossible to understand, but it's really me. It's James." My knees buckled. I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling, my vision blurring as shockwaves rolled through my entire body. The laundry basket I'd been carrying tumbled to the floor, spilling freshly folded clothes across the entryway. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "No, you're dead. You died in France. I got the telegram. I went to your memorial service. You're dead, James. You've been dead for many years." "I know," he said gently, taking a small step forward but not trying to enter my house uninvited. His hands were raised slightly, palms out, the way you might approach a frightened animal. "I know what they told you, and I know what you've believed all this time. But Kathy, sweetheart, I'm not dead. I'm here. I'm real. I came back to you, just like I promised I would." The sound of my old nickname on his lips nearly destroyed me. I hadn't heard anyone call me Kathy since 1944. Robert called me Catherine. The children called me Mama. Friends called me Mrs. Harrison. But Kathy had been James's name for me, his special name, and hearing it again was like a key turning in a lock I thought had been permanently sealed. I studied his face desperately, looking for some sign that this was a cruel hoax. Some evidence that this was an imposter trying to take advantage of a war widow's grief. But every detail was right. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd told me about. The way his smile was slightly crooked. The exact shade of blue in his eyes that I'd tried unsuccessfully to describe to portrait artists over the years. "This isn't possible," I said, my voice rising dangerously. From somewhere in the house, I heard Robert stirring in his chair, disturbed by the commotion. "You can't be here. You can't be real. I buried you, James. I grieved you. I moved on. I have a family now, a husband, children. You can't just show up like this." James's face crumpled with pain at my words, and I saw tears well up in those familiar eyes. "I know," he said, his own voice breaking. "God, Kathy, I know how impossible this must be. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I wanted to come back and find that you'd built a whole life without me? But I had no choice. I only just remembered. I only just remembered you, remembered us, remembered who I was before." "Before what?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice down even as hysteria threatened to overwhelm me. "Before you decided to let me think you were dead for so long. Before you let me cry myself to sleep for months? Before you let me marry another man, because I thought I was a widow? Before you let me have children with someone else, because I thought the man I wanted to have babies with was rotting in some French field? The words poured out of me like poison. So many years of suppressed anger and grief, suddenly finding their target. James flinched with each accusation as if I were physically striking him, but he didn't defend himself, didn't interrupt my tirade. Before I lost my memory, he said quietly when I finally ran out of words. Before I spent 15 years not even knowing my own name, let alone yours. Before I lived as a stranger to myself with no past, no identity, no understanding of who I had been or who I was supposed to become. The words hit me like a physical blow. Memory loss. Amnesia. It sounded like something from a Hollywood movie, too dramatic and convenient to be real. But looking at his face, seeing the pain and confusion and desperate hope in his eyes, I knew he was telling the truth. James had never been a liar, not even about small things. He wouldn't lie about this. "Catherine!" Robert's voice came from behind me, thick with sleep and concern. "Is everything all right? I thought I heard voices. And what happened to the laundry?" Panic shot through me like electricity. I spun around to see my husband of 16 years standing in the hallway, adjusting his glasses and looking concerned. His graying hair was mussed from sleep, and he wore the comfortable cardigan I'd given him for his last birthday. Behind him, I could hear the children's laughter from the backyard, blissfully unaware that their mother's world was collapsing. "Robert," I said, my voice sounding strange and high to my own ears. There's someone here. Someone from before." I couldn't bring myself to say the words. How do you tell your husband that your supposedly dead first husband is standing on your front porch, very much alive? Robert moved closer, his medical instincts probably picking up on my obvious distress. I saw the exact moment he understood what was happening. His medical training had taught him to read situations quickly, and his face went pale as he looked past me to the man in the doorway. He had seen James's photograph many times over the years. I had never hidden my first marriage from him or the children, and recognition dawned with stunning clarity. "James Mitchell," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Robert Harrison," James replied, equally quiet. He straightened his shoulders, and I caught a glimpse of the soldier he had once been. I'm sorry. I know this must be impossible," Robert finished. "Yes, it is impossible. You died a long time ago. Catherine has your death certificate. She received your personal effects from the War Department. So I've been told," James said, and there was a trace of the dry humor I remembered so well. "But as you can see, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. The three of us stood there in the most awkward tableau imaginable. The supposedly dead first husband, the very much alive second husband, and me, the woman who had somehow managed to be wife to both of them without meaning to become a bigamist. I felt like I was drowning in the surreal nature of the situation. My two worlds were colliding in the most devastating way possible. Robert, steady and reliable, the man who had helped me rebuild my life from the ashes of war. James, passionate and lost, the great love of my youth, who had shaped everything I understood about romantic love. And here I was, standing between them like some kind of unwitting bigamist, my heart being pulled in two different directions by two different versions of love. "Mama?" Margaret's voice came from the backyard, growing closer. "Mama, where are you? Thomas broke the fort, and I need you to tell him he has to fix it. And also, can we have some lemonade? It's getting really hot out here." "Not now, sweetheart," I called back, my voice cracking with stress. "Stay in the backyard for a few more minutes. I'll bring you lemonade soon." James's face transformed at the sound of Margaret's voice calling me Mama. The reality of my new life, my children who had never been his children, hit him with visible force. He gripped the doorframe as if he needed the physical support, and I saw his knuckles turn white. "You have kids," he said, and it wasn't a question. "2," I whispered. "Margaret is 15. Thomas is 13. They're beautiful names," he said, and I could see him doing the math in his head, realizing that my children had been born and raised during the years he thought he would be building a family with me. I'm glad you found happiness, Kathy. I really am." But his eyes told a different story. His eyes were full of loss and longing, and the terrible understanding that he had missed not just my life, but an entire lifetime. He had missed my pregnancies, my children's first steps, their first words, their birthdays, their scraped knees and broken hearts and triumphant moments. He had missed watching me become a mother, had missed becoming a father himself. "But I'm alive too." Thomas's voice drifted from the backyard, followed by Margaret's exasperated sigh. "I didn't break the fort on purpose. It just fell down because Margaret didn't listen when I said we needed more support beams." James closed his eyes at the sound of my son's voice. My son, who was not his son, and I saw tears leak from beneath his closed lids. 13 and 15. He repeated softly, They sound wonderful." Robert, to his eternal credit, stepped forward with the kind of calm professionalism that had made him such a good doctor. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself. This was his family, too. His children he had raised from infancy. His wife he had loved and supported for 16 years. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "this is obviously a complex situation that requires careful discussion. Perhaps you'd like to come in, or we could meet somewhere more private to talk this through." "I don't think that's a good idea," I said quickly, the practical part of my mind finally kicking in. "The children, they don't know about... They can't see... We need to figure this out before they get involved." The thought of having to explain this to Margaret and Thomas terrified me. How do you tell your children that their mother was married before, that their mother's first husband, who was supposed to be dead, is actually alive? How do you explain that their entire understanding of their family history is about to be turned upside down? James nodded immediately. "Of course, I understand. I don't want to upset your children, Catherine, or make this any harder than it already is." He paused, looking between Robert and me with an expression of such profound sadness that it broke my heart all over again. "Is there somewhere we could meet? Tomorrow, maybe? I have so much to explain, so much to tell you about where I've been, what happened to me, and I need to understand. I need to understand your life now." The practical arrangements felt surreal. Making plans to meet with your supposedly dead husband, while your very much alive husband stands beside you, offering suggestions. But what else could we do? There was no handbook for this situation, no social protocol for resurrection. Before I answer, let me pause here because I know some of you are probably wondering what you would do in this impossible situation. Have you ever faced a moment where your past and present collided so dramatically that you didn't know which way was up? If you're finding Catherine's story as compelling as I hope you are, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. These stories of love, loss, and the unexpected ways life can surprise us deserve to be shared. And I'm curious what you think Catherine should do next. Should she meet with James to hear his explanation? Or should she protect the family she's built? Leave your thoughts in the comments. "There's a small cafe downtown," Robert said, surprising both James and me with his willingness to facilitate this meeting. "Morrison's on 5th Street. It's usually quiet in the afternoons." "You don't have to be part of this, Robert," I said, suddenly protective of the man who had given me 16 years of stable, loving marriage. "This is my mess to sort out." "Catherine," Robert said gently, taking my hand. Anything that affects you affects me. We're married, we're partners, and we'll handle this together. Besides, he added with a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, as a doctor, I'm rather curious about this amnesia situation. If it's real, it's quite remarkable. James looked at our joined hands, and I saw him swallow hard. The simple gesture of marital solidarity seemed to hit him harder than all my angry words had. This was the evidence of my new life that he couldn't argue with or explain away. The casual intimacy between Robert and me, the way we instinctively turned to each other in crisis. Tomorrow, then? 2 o'clock? I nodded, not trusting my voice. The surreal nature of the situation was starting to hit me. I was making plans to meet with my supposedly dead husband, while my very much alive husband held my hand and offered medical curiosity about the situation. If someone had written this scenario in a book, I would have called it completely unbelievable. I should go, James said, backing away from the door. I'm staying at the Palmer House downtown, room 237, if you need to reach me for any reason. He looked at me with such longing that my heart broke all over again. Kathy, I know this is impossible. I know it's unfair and terrible, and probably the worst thing that could happen to you right now. But I want you to know that not a day went by, once I remembered, that I didn't think about finding my way back to you. How long? I asked, the question torn from somewhere deep inside me. How long have you remembered? 6 months, he admitted, and the words hit me like a slap. It took me this long to work up the courage to come back, to face what I might find. Part of me hoped, part of me foolishly hoped that maybe you'd still be waiting. 6 months. He had known who he was, had remembered our love, our marriage, our promises to each other. For 6 months. While I had been living my normal life, helping Margaret with her college applications, attending Thomas's baseball games, celebrating my 16th wedding anniversary with Robert, James had been out there somewhere, remembering me, planning this moment. 6 months, I repeated, feeling anger rise alongside my confusion and grief. You remembered me 6 months ago, and you're just now coming to find me? James looked stricken. I hired a private investigator first, he said quietly. I needed to know. I needed to know what I was walking into. When I found out you had remarried, had children, I almost didn't come at all. I spent weeks walking around Chicago, starting toward the train station and then turning back. I didn't want to hurt you, Kathy. I didn't want to destroy your happiness. But you came anyway, I said, and I wasn't sure if I was grateful or furious. But I came anyway, he agreed, because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. Because you deserved to know that I kept my promise, even if it took me so many years to do it. Because some part of me, the selfish part, needed to see you one more time, needed to tell you that you were never forgotten, never stopped being loved. The pain in his voice was unbearable. James, I said softly, I waited 4 years. I wore black for a year, mourned for 3 more, and only started living again when I thought you were never coming back. I waited until waiting became another kind of dying. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I know, and I'm not here to ask you to blow up your life or hurt your family. I needed to see you. I needed you to know that I kept my promise, even if it took me so long to do it. Mama! Margaret's voice was getting closer, more insistent. Mama, where are you? We're really thirsty out here. The sound of my daughter's voice brought me crashing back to the present moment, to the life that existed beyond this impossible reunion. I had responsibilities, people depending on me, a world that couldn't stop, just because my past had walked back into my present. I have to go, I said, panic rising in my voice. The children, they can't see. They can't know about this yet. With that, James turned and walked away, his shoulders heavy with the weight of 2 decades, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes promises, kept too late, become their own kind of heartbreak. I watched him disappear around the corner, this man who had been the love of my youth, the ghost who had haunted my dreams, the memory I had finally learned to live with. And now he was real again, flesh and blood again, walking away from me just like he had at that train station years ago. But this time, he wasn't going to war. This time, he was walking away from the war zone that had become my heart. Robert closed the door gently and wrapped his arms around me as I finally allowed myself to fall apart. What am I going to do? I sobbed against his chest. Robert, what am I going to do? How do you choose between 2 loves when they're both real, both valid, both part of who you are? I don't know, sweetheart, he said, stroking my hair like he had comforted me through so many smaller crises over the years. But we'll figure it out together. Whatever happens, whatever you decide, we'll figure it out. As I clung to my second husband and cried for my first, I realized that some stories don't end when we think they do. Some loves don't stay buried when we think they should. And sometimes the greatest challenge isn't learning to love again after loss, but figuring out what to do when the loss turns out not to be permanent after all. The children were still playing in the backyard, still innocent of the earthquake that had just shaken their mother's world. Tomorrow I would sit across from a man I had loved with all my heart, a man I had grieved and mourned and finally released, and I would have to decide what his resurrection meant for the life I had built in his absence. But tonight, I would hold Robert close and try to figure out how you love 2 people at the same time without betraying them both. How do you honor the past without destroying the present? How do you choose between 2 different versions of happily ever after? Tomorrow I would begin to find out. I barely slept that night. Robert and I lay in our bed, the same bed we had shared for 16 years, but the space between us felt like an ocean. We didn't talk about what would happen tomorrow, didn't discuss the impossible situation we found ourselves in. Instead, we held hands in the dark, both of us staring at the ceiling, both of us afraid to voice the questions that were tearing us apart. What do you say to your husband when your supposedly dead first husband reappears? What promises do you make when you don't know which promises you'll be able to keep? I had told the children that I had a doctor's appointment downtown the next afternoon, and Margaret had rolled her eyes and said, "Another one, Mama. You've been to more doctor's appointments this year than Grandma." If only she knew that this particular appointment might change everything she thought she knew about her family. Morrison's cafe was exactly as Robert had described. Quiet, dimly lit, with small tables tucked into corners that offered privacy for difficult conversations. I arrived 5 minutes early, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely order coffee from the waitress. Robert had offered to come with me, but I'd told him I needed to hear James's story alone first, needed to understand what had happened before we decided how to move forward as a family. James was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, a habit I recognized from his army days. He had always said you never knew who might be coming through the door, so you positioned yourself to see everything. He stood when he saw me, that old-fashioned courtesy still intact after all those years, and I felt my heart clench at the familiar gesture. He looked different in daylight, older and more weathered than he had appeared in the shock of yesterday's encounter. His clothes were neat but worn, and I noticed his hands as he gestured for me to sit. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who had done hard physical labor for years. These weren't the smooth hands of the young soldier I had kissed goodbye at that train station. "Thank you for coming, Kathy," he said as I slid into the booth across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. Part of me thought that if I didn't show up, maybe yesterday would turn out to be a dream, and I could go back to my normal life. "But you're here," he said softly. But I'm here, I agreed. Because I need to understand, James. I need to know where you've been for all those years, and why the War Department told me you were dead, and how a person just loses their memory for 15 years. He nodded and took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. When he began to speak, his voice was steady but distant, as if he was telling someone else's story rather than his own. "The last thing I remember from the war," he said, "was writing that final letter to you. We were moving out the next morning for what our commanding officer said would be a major offensive. I remember sealing the envelope, giving it to Frank Morrison to mail, and then—" He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "Then nothing. For 15 years. Absolutely nothing." I waited, my coffee growing cold in my hands, as I tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. "According to the medical records, I was finally able to track down," James continued. "Our unit was ambushed about 6 miles outside a small French village. Most of the men were killed immediately. I was found 3 days later by French resistance fighters, unconscious and barely alive. I had taken severe head trauma from shrapnel, and they weren't sure I was going to make it." The clinical way he described what must have been a horrific experience made my stomach turn. "The resistance fighters took me to a local doctor, an old man who had been treating wounded soldiers in secret throughout the occupation. He saved my life, but the head injury had done serious damage. When I finally woke up weeks later, I didn't know my name, didn't know where I was, didn't remember anything about my past." "Nothing?" I whispered. "Nothing," he confirmed. The doctor said it was the worst case of retrograde amnesia he had ever seen. Everything before the injury was just gone. And because I had no identification, no dog tags that survived the explosion, no way to tell them who I was or where I came from, they had no way to contact anyone. I tried to imagine it, waking up in a strange place, speaking a language you suddenly couldn't understand, with no memory of who you had been or who was waiting for you back home. The terror of it made my hands shake. "The War Department must have assumed I was dead," James continued. "If they found my unit destroyed and couldn't account for my body, they would have listed me as killed in action. They had no way of knowing that French civilians had pulled me from the wreckage. So what happened then?" I asked. "Where did you go? What did you do?" "I stayed in France for about 2 years," he said. "The doctor and his wife were kind to me, tried to help me remember, but nothing came back. They called me Jean, because that was the only name I seemed to respond to, even though I couldn't remember why. When the war ended, I was still too confused and damaged to figure out how to get back to America, even if I had remembered that was where I belonged." He paused to drink his coffee, and I could see the pain in his eyes as he relived those lost years. "Eventually, I made my way to England, then got passage on a cargo ship to New York in 1947. I had no money, no identification, no skills that I could remember. I just knew I needed to keep moving, like something was pulling me west." "West?" I echoed. "I ended up in a small town in Ohio called Millfield, about 60 miles from where I grew up, though I didn't know that at the time. I got work as a carpenter's apprentice, learned the trade from an old German immigrant named Hans Weber. He never asked too many questions about my past, just gave me a job and a place to stay above his workshop. The irony wasn't lost on me. James had ended up so close to his childhood home, pulled there by some instinct he couldn't understand. Did anything ever feel familiar?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Certain smells, certain sounds would make me feel homesick, I suppose, though I didn't know for what. I would dream about a woman with dark hair and green eyes, but I thought she was just a fantasy, something my damaged mind had created to fill the emptiness." My breath caught. "You dreamed about me?" "Every night for all those years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Even when I couldn't remember your name or your face clearly, I dreamed about you. About dancing with you. About making you laugh. About promising to come back to someone who was waiting for me. The dreams were the only constant in my life. Tears were sliding down my cheeks now, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. To think that some part of him had been reaching for me across all those years of silence and separation. Hans gave me the name John Smith for the official paperwork," James continued. "Said it was as good as any other for a man with no past. So for 15 years I was John Smith, carpenter, quiet man, who kept to himself and did good work with his hands. Did you ever... Were there other women?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I immediately felt foolish for asking. James looked at me with such tenderness that my heart broke all over again. "There were a few women over the years who showed interest," he said honestly. "And I tried, Kathy. God knows I tried to feel something for someone, to build a life with the tools I had left. But every relationship felt empty, like I was trying to fit into clothes that belonged to someone else. I could never shake the feeling that I was supposed to be somewhere else, with someone else, living some other life entirely." He reached across the table and gently touched my hand, the first physical contact we'd had since he'd reappeared in my life. Now I know why. Some part of me, the part that the injury couldn't touch, was always trying to get back to you. "So how did you remember?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. "It started about 8 months ago," he said. "I was working on a kitchen renovation for a young couple, installing cabinets in their new home. The wife was pregnant, and she was showing her husband a locket her grandmother had given her, something to pass down to the baby. When she opened it, there was this tiny photograph inside, and something about the gesture, the way the light caught the gold." He paused, lost in the memory. "It hit me like lightning, Kathy. Suddenly I could see you so clearly, standing in our little apartment, showing me a locket just like that one. I could remember buying it for you. Remember putting my photograph inside. Remember the way you cried when I fastened it around your neck." My hand flew to my throat, to the locket I still wore every day. "After that, the memories started coming back in pieces," James continued. "Our wedding, our honeymoon, the hospital where we met, your laugh, your voice calling me to dinner. But they were all jumbled up, like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. It took months before I could put together a coherent picture of who I had been, who we had been together. And when you finally remembered everything, I hired a private investigator," he said. "It took him 2 months to track you down. When he came back with his report," James's voice broke slightly, "when he told me you had remarried, that you had children, that you had built a whole beautiful life without me, I wanted to die all over again." The pain in his voice was unbearable. I wanted to comfort him, but I didn't know how. How do you apologize for moving on from someone who wasn't really dead? "I spent weeks deciding what to do," he continued. "The investigator had given me your address, photographs of you and your family, details about your husband's medical practice, your children's schools. I would sit in my little apartment above Hans's workshop, staring at pictures of the life you had built, trying to decide whether I had any right to disrupt it. What made you finally decide to come?" James was quiet for a long moment, staring out the cafe window at the busy street beyond. "I realized that you deserved to know the truth," he said finally. "Not because I expected anything from you. Not because I thought I could just waltz back into your life and pick up where we left off, but because you had spent years thinking I had broken my promise to come back to you. And I couldn't live with that lie, even if the truth was more complicated than either of us could handle. So here we are," I said softly. "So here we are," he agreed. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us trying to absorb the magnitude of what he had told me. Years of lost time, of parallel lives that should have been lived together. Years of him dreaming about a woman he couldn't remember, while I grieved for a man I thought was dead. "Kathy," James said finally, "I need you to know that I'm not here to ask you to choose between me and your family. I know that's not fair, and I know it's not realistic. Your husband seems like a good man, your children are clearly thriving, and you've built something beautiful together. Then why are you here?" I asked, though I thought I knew the answer. "Because I needed to see you one more time," he said simply. "Because I needed you to know that you were never forgotten, never unloved, never abandoned by choice. Because some promises are too important to leave broken, even when keeping them comes so many years too late." The waitress came by to refill our coffee cups, and I used the interruption to study James's face, trying to reconcile the young soldier I had married with this weathered man sitting across from me. The years had been kind to him in some ways. He was still handsome, still had that gentle strength that had first attracted me. But I could see the cost of his lost decades in the lines around his eyes, in the way he held himself like someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. "What happens now?" I asked when the waitress had gone. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been so focused on finding you, on telling you the truth, that I haven't thought much beyond this moment. I suppose I'll go back to Ohio, back to my carpentry work. Hans is getting old, and he's been talking about retiring. Maybe I'll take over his business, settle into being John Smith permanently. Is that what you want?" He looked at me with such longing that it took my breath away. "What I want is impossible, Kathy. What I want is to go back to 1944 and not get captured, not lose my memory, not let many years pass without you. What I want is to have been there when you needed me most, to have built that life we planned together, to have watched you become the mother I can see you are now." His voice broke on the last words. "What I want is to have earned the right to ask you to love me again. But I know that's not how life works. I know that all of this time is too long, that too much has happened, that you belong to someone else now." I felt like my heart was being torn in two. Part of me wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, to tell him that I had never stopped loving him, that some part of me had been waiting for him all these years, without even knowing it. But the rational part of my mind, the part that had responsibilities and commitments, knew that love alone wasn't enough to bridge so many years of separation. "James," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. When I thought you were dead, it nearly destroyed me. It took me years to learn how to live again, how to love again, how to believe in happiness again. Robert didn't just marry me. He saved me. He put me back together piece by piece, gave me children, gave me stability, gave me a life worth living." "I know," he said quietly. "I can't just throw that away," I continued, tears streaming down my face. "Even for you, even for what we once had. It wouldn't be fair to him, or to Margaret and Thomas, or even to myself. I'm not asking you to," he said, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "But I also can't pretend that seeing you again hasn't changed everything," I admitted. "Because it has. Because sitting here with you listening to your story, I can feel that old love trying to wake up inside me. And I don't know what to do with that, James. I don't know how to love two men at the same time without betraying them both." We sat there in that dim cafe, two people who had loved each other completely, years ago, trying to figure out what love meant when life had taken such an unexpected turn. The impossibility of our situation hung between us like a wall we couldn't cross, no matter how much we might want to. "Can I ask you something?" James said finally. I nodded. "Are you happy? Really, truly happy with the life you've built?" The question caught me off guard, and I found myself thinking carefully before answering. Yes, I said finally. I am happy. Maybe not the passionate, all-consuming happiness we had when we were young, but a deeper, more settled kind of happiness. Robert and I are partners, friends, companions. We respect each other, support each other, enjoy each other's company. The children are wonderful, bright and funny and kind. We have a good life together, James. A really good life. He nodded, and I could see him trying to find peace in my answer. Then I'm glad, he said, and I believed him. I'm glad you found happiness, even if it wasn't with me. But that doesn't mean I don't still love you, I said, the admission torn from somewhere deep in my soul. Because I do, James. God help me. I still love you. Not the same way I love Robert. Not with the same urgency or desperation we felt when we were young. But you're still there, in my heart, in some chamber I thought had been sealed forever. His eyes filled with tears. And you're still in mine, he whispered. You always have been, even when I couldn't remember your name. We were quiet for a long time after that, both of us crying silently, both of us mourning not just the years we had lost, but the impossible choice that lay ahead. How do you choose between honoring the past and protecting the present? How do you decide between the great love of your youth and the stable love of your maturity? I should go, James said finally, pulling out his wallet to pay for our untouched coffee. I've taken up enough of your time, disrupted your life enough. Where will you go? I asked. Back to Ohio, like I said. Back to being John Smith, carpenter, man with no past and no future. Just an endless present of sawdust and silence. The image broke my heart. James, don't do that to yourself. Don't disappear again, not completely. Maybe we can't be what we once were, but that doesn't mean you have to vanish from the world. He stood up and looked down at me with such tenderness that I wanted to weep. Goodbye, Catherine, he said, deliberately using the formal version of my name. Thank you for listening, for understanding, for giving me the chance to explain. I hope you'll think of me sometimes, when you're old and gray and telling your grandchildren stories about your adventures. James, wait, I started to say. But he was already walking away, moving through the cafe with that familiar military bearing, leaving me alone with my coffee and my impossible choice. As I watched him disappear into the crowd on 5th Street, I realized that some stories don't have happy endings, not in the traditional sense. Some loves are too big for the lives we build around them, too complicated for simple resolutions. But maybe, I thought as I finally took a sip of my cold coffee, maybe the point isn't the ending. Maybe the point is that love survives everything. War, time, memory loss, other loves, impossible circumstances. Maybe the point is that some connections between souls are so deep that they transcend the boundaries of what we think is possible. I didn't know what I was going to tell Robert when I got home. I didn't know how I was going to live with the knowledge that my first love was out there somewhere, alive and remembering me after all these years. I didn't know how to reconcile the woman I had been with James with the woman I had become with Robert. But I did know one thing. The choice ahead of me would define not just my future, but who I was as a person, as a wife, as a mother, as someone who had been given the rarest of gifts. A second chance at first love, arriving many years too late to be simple. The question was, what was I going to do with it? I sat in my car outside Morrison's cafe for 20 minutes after James left, trying to figure out how to go home and face my family with this enormous secret weighing on my heart. How do you walk back into your normal life when everything you thought you knew about love, loss, and second chances has been turned completely upside down? When I finally gathered the courage to drive home, I found Robert in his study, pretending to read medical journals but clearly waiting for me. The children were in the living room, Catherine helping Thomas with his algebra homework, while she complained about how completely useless math would be in her future career as a novelist. "How did it go?" Robert asked gently, closing his journal and giving me his full attention. I sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly exhausted. "It's all true, Robert. The amnesia, the 15 years of not knowing who he was. Everything. He really did lose his memory, and he really has been trying to find his way back to me all this time." Robert was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this information. As a physician, he understood better than most people how head trauma could affect memory. "What else did he tell you?" So I told him everything. About the ambush in France, about the resistance fighters who saved James's life, about the years he spent as John Smith the carpenter, about the dreams that haunted him every night, without him understanding why. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or asking a clarifying question, approaching James's story with the same analytical mind he brought to difficult medical cases. "And how do you feel about all of this?" he asked when I finished. That was the question I had been dreading, because I wasn't sure I could answer it honestly, without hurting the man who had spent 16 years loving me, supporting me, building a life with me. "Confused," I said finally. "Heartbroken. Guilty. Angry. Grateful. I feel everything all at once, and I don't know how to sort through any of it." "Do you still love him?" Robert asked, and his voice was so gentle, so understanding that it made me cry all over again. "Yes," I whispered. "Not the same way I love you, but yes, I still love him. And I hate myself for it because it feels like a betrayal of everything we've built together." Robert got up from his chair and came around the desk to kneel beside me, taking my hands in his just like he had the day before when James first appeared at our door. "Catherine, loving someone isn't a betrayal. Love isn't a finite resource that gets used up. The fact that you still have feelings for your first husband doesn't diminish what we have together." "But it changes things," I said. "How can it not change things?" "Maybe it does," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean it has to change them for the worse. We've been married for 16 years, sweetheart. We've weathered illness and financial stress and raising 2 teenagers and all the ordinary challenges of building a life together. If our marriage can't survive this, then it wasn't as strong as I thought it was." His calm acceptance of the situation amazed me. "How can you be so understanding about this? Aren't you angry? Aren't you afraid I'm going to leave you for him?" Robert smiled sadly. "Of course I'm afraid. I'm terrified. But I also know you, Catherine Harrison. I know your sense of duty, your loyalty, your deep commitment to family. I know that you wouldn't throw away the 16 years of marriage and 2 children's stability for a romantic fantasy, no matter how compelling that fantasy might be." He was right, and we both knew it. But that didn't make the situation any less painful or complicated. "We need to tell the children," I said. "They're going to find out eventually, and it should come from us." Robert nodded. "How do you want to handle that?" "Together," I said. "As a family, as their parents." That evening, after dinner and homework were finished, Robert and I called Margaret and Thomas into the living room for what we euphemistically called a family meeting. Both children immediately looked worried. In their experience, family meetings usually meant someone was in trouble or something serious was wrong. "Nobody's in trouble," I assured them quickly. "But there is something important we need to tell you both, something about our family history that you didn't know before." Margaret, always the more perceptive of my 2 children, studied my face carefully. "This is about why you were acting so weird yesterday, isn't it? And about your mysterious doctor's appointment today?" "It wasn't really a doctor's appointment," I admitted. "I was meeting with someone from my past, someone I thought was dead, but who turned out to be alive after all." Thomas looked confused. "Who could be dead but not dead? That doesn't make sense." I took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change my children's understanding of their family forever. Before I married your father, when I was very young, I was married to someone else, a soldier named James Mitchell. We were only married for a few months before he went to war in Europe, and I received word that he had been killed in action. Margaret's eyes widened. You were married before Dad? I was. And yesterday, James showed up at our front door, very much alive. He had been severely injured in the war and lost his memory for 15 years. He only recently remembered who he was and came looking for me. The silence that followed was deafening. Both children stared at me as if I had just told them I was secretly a space alien. So, you have 2 husbands? Thomas asked, his 13-year-old mind trying to work through the logistics of the situation. No, sweetheart. I have one husband, your father. James and I were married a long time ago, but I thought he was dead. So I married Dad and built a new life. Legally and emotionally, Dad is my real husband now. But what about the other guy? Margaret asked. What's he gonna do now that he's back? It was Robert who answered. That's something your mother and I are still figuring out. But I want you both to understand that this doesn't change anything about our family. I'm still your father, your mother is still your mother, and we're still a family. This is just a complicated situation that we're all going to work through together. Margaret, who had inherited my practical nature along with my stubborn streak, was the first to recover from the shock. Can we meet him? She asked. I mean, if he was married to Mom, he's kind of part of our family history, right? It would be weird not to know him at all. The question caught both Robert and me off guard. We hadn't discussed whether the children would ever meet James, or whether that would be appropriate given the circumstances. Maybe, I said carefully, if everyone is comfortable with that idea, maybe we could arrange a meeting. But this is a very delicate situation, and we need to be thoughtful about how we handle it. Thomas, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Is he going to try to take you away from us? The fear in his voice broke my heart. Oh, honey, no. Absolutely not. No one is going to take me away from you. You and Margaret and Dad are my family, my life, my everything. That's never going to change, no matter what happens with James. Over the next few days, our house felt like it was holding its breath. The children asked occasional questions about James, about my first marriage, about what it was like to think someone was dead for all of those years. Robert and I talked late into the night about how to navigate this unprecedented situation, about what it meant for our marriage, about what we owed to James and to ourselves and to each other. And through it all, I couldn't stop thinking about James, alone in his hotel room, preparing to go back to Ohio and resume his life as John Smith, carpenter and man with no past. The image of him disappearing back into anonymity felt wrong, like leaving a wound only partially healed. On Thursday morning, 4 days after our meeting at Morrison's Cafe, I made a decision. I want to see him again. I told Robert over breakfast, after the children had left for school. I want to talk to him about finding a way for him to be part of our lives, somehow. Not romantically, I added quickly, seeing the look on Robert's face, but as a friend, as someone who was once important to me, and who deserves better than just disappearing again. Robert considered this carefully. What are you thinking exactly? I don't know yet. Maybe we could help him settle somewhere nearby. Help him build a new life that isn't quite so isolated. Maybe the children could get to know him gradually. Learn about that part of my history. Maybe we could find a way to honor what he and I once had without threatening what you and I have now. That sounds complicated, Robert said mildly. Everything about this situation is complicated. But I keep thinking that there has to be a better solution than just pretending he doesn't exist. Robert was quiet for several minutes, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "You know," he said finally, "I've been thinking about James a lot over the past few days. About what it must be like to wake up from 15 years of amnesia and discover that the woman you love has moved on, built a family, created a whole life without you. It must be devastating," I agreed. "It is. But it's also remarkably selfless of him to walk away without making demands or trying to disrupt our family. A lot of men in his situation might have approached this very differently. I knew what Robert was getting at. James could have been angry, demanding, possessive. He could have tried to convince me that our first love trumped everything else, that I owed him something because of what he had suffered. Instead, he had simply told me his story and walked away, leaving the choice entirely up to me. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying that maybe we owe him something too. Not romantically, not in a way that threatens our marriage, but as human beings who care about each other's well-being. Maybe there is a way to help him build a life that includes friendship, with us, connection to the family you've built, a sense of belonging somewhere." That afternoon, I called the Palmer house and left a message for James, asking him to meet me at Morrison's Cafe again the next day. This time, I asked Robert to come with me. James looked surprised to see both of us when he arrived, but he greeted Robert respectfully and settled into the booth across from us, with the careful dignity I was learning was characteristic of the man he had become. "Catherine said you wanted to see me again," he said. "I hope this doesn't mean you've been worrying about me. I meant what I said about going back to Ohio and getting on with my life. That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about," Robert said, surprising James by taking the lead in the conversation. "Catherine and I have been discussing your situation, and we don't think disappearing back into anonymity is the best solution for anyone." James looked confused. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, trying to find the right words for what we were proposing. "James, you spent 15 years not knowing who you were, and the last years living as someone else entirely. Don't you think it's time for James Mitchell to actually have a life? I appreciate the sentiment, Kathy, but my life is what it is. I can't change the past, and I can't expect you to build a future around someone who took all of this time to keep his promise." "We're not talking about building a future around you," Robert said gently. "We're talking about building you into our future, as a friend, as someone who matters to our family." James stared at us as if we had lost our minds. "You want me to be part of your family, after everything that's happened?" "Why not?" I asked. "You're part of my history, part of who I am. The children are curious about you, about their mother's past. Robert thinks you're a decent man who deserves better than a life of isolation. And I think there might be a way to honor what we once had while still protecting what I have now." "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert and I had discussed this extensively over the past few days, and we had come up with what we hoped was a workable plan. "There's a construction company here in town that specializes in historical renovations," Robert said. "The owner, Tom Bradley, is a patient of mine. He's been looking for an experienced carpenter who understands older building techniques. The pay is good, and there's steady work. You'd help me get a job here?" James asked, clearly astonished. "If you want one," I said. "There's also a small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street that's been vacant for months. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and affordable, and it would give you a place to start over properly." "And in return?" "No return," Robert said firmly. "This isn't a transaction, James. This is just the right thing to do. You've lost enough of your life already. If we can help you reclaim some of it in a way that works for everyone, why wouldn't we?" James was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling to process what we were offering him. "And Catherine?" he asked finally. "How would this work with... How would we handle the fact that we have a history together? I had thought about this question extensively. Carefully, I said. Honestly, with respect for the love we once shared, and the love I share now with Robert. As friends who care about each other's well-being, but who understand that some doors can't be reopened, no matter how much we might want to. I'd want to get to know you, James said to Robert. If I'm going to be part of this community, part of Catherine's extended family, I need to understand who you are, what kind of man she chose to build her life with. Robert smiled. I'd like that too. I think we have more in common than you might expect. Before I continue with how this remarkable story concluded, I want to pause one more time. Catherine's journey from young war bride to widow to wife and mother again, and finally to a woman faced with an impossible choice about love and loyalty, has been extraordinary. If her story has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who might find meaning in tales of love's complexity. And I'm curious what you think of the solution Catherine and Robert proposed to James. Was it wise, generous, or potentially dangerous? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Over the next several months, our unconventional arrangement slowly took shape. James got the job with Tom Bradley's construction company and moved into the apartment on Main Street. He threw himself into his work with the dedication of a man grateful for a second chance at building a real life. The children met him, gradually, carefully, with Robert and me present to navigate any awkward moments. Margaret was fascinated by his stories about France during the war and his years of lost memory. Thomas, initially suspicious of this stranger who had once been married to his mother, eventually warmed up to James's patient kindness and willingness to help with carpentry projects. James and Robert developed an unlikely friendship, bonding over their shared love of baseball and their mutual protectiveness of me and the children. Watching them together was surreal at first, my two husbands, past and present, discussing batting averages and medical advances with easy camaraderie. But it worked. Somehow, impossibly, it worked. James began joining us for Sunday dinners, bringing flowers for me, and helping Margaret with her college essays about overcoming adversity. He taught Thomas how to build proper birdhouses and listened patiently to Robert's theories about new surgical techniques. He became Uncle James to my children, a beloved family friend with a mysterious past that gradually became less mysterious as he shared more stories about his adventures and misadventures. And yes, there were moments of tension, moments when the history between James and me created awkwardness or confusion. There were times when I caught him looking at me with longing he tried to hide, times when I felt the pull of our old connection and had to remind myself of my commitments and priorities. There were conversations Robert and I had late at night about boundaries and feelings and the complicated mathematics of love. But mostly there was peace. The peace that comes from doing the right thing even when it's difficult, from choosing generosity over fear, from believing that the heart is big enough to hold complex truths without breaking. James never remarried, though he dated occasionally over the years. He said once, during a particularly honest conversation, that he had used up his capacity for that kind of love on me, and he was content to channel his affection into his friendships, his work, and his role as honorary uncle to Margaret and Thomas. As the years passed, our unconventional family arrangement became simply normal. James was present for graduations and weddings, for the births of grandchildren, for holidays and celebrations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. He and Robert aged into comfortable companions, and the three of us learned to navigate the delicate balance between honoring the past and embracing the present. Margaret often said that having James in her life taught her that love comes in many forms, that families can be built from the most unlikely materials, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to be part of something larger than their own loneliness. Thomas, who became a carpenter himself partly inspired by James's craftsmanship, said that watching his parents handle such a complicated situation with grace and wisdom taught him more about character and integrity than any lecture could have. And me? I learned that love isn't always about choosing between options. Sometimes love is about expanding your definition of what's possible, about refusing to let circumstances force you into impossible either-or decisions. I learned that the heart doesn't operate like a bank account, where loving one person means having less love for another. Instead, it operates more like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. I never stopped loving James, but I also never stopped loving Robert. They were different loves for different seasons of my life, and somehow, miraculously, I found a way to honor both without betraying either. James lived to be 82 years old, spending his final years in a small house just 2 blocks from ours, surrounded by the family he had never expected to have. Robert and I held his hands as he died peacefully in his sleep, and we buried him in the cemetery next to the memorial stone that had been erected in his honor 40 years earlier when he was presumed dead. At his funeral, the chaplain spoke about second chances and unconventional families and the mysterious ways that love finds to survive even the most impossible circumstances. Catherine read a poem about soldiers who keep their promises even when it takes them a long time to do so. Thomas built James's coffin himself, using techniques James had taught him, calling it his final gift to the man who had taught him that families are made not just by blood, but by choice, commitment, and the courage to include rather than exclude. And I spoke about the great truth that James's return had taught me, that love isn't diminished by being shared, that families can expand to include the most unlikely members, and that sometimes the most profound act of love is creating space for all the people who matter, even when conventional wisdom says it's impossible. Robert lived another 8 years after James died, and we often talked about how grateful we were for the choice we had made all those years ago to include rather than exclude, to build bridges rather than walls. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked me once. "Do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if James had never come back?" "Never," I told him, and I meant it. James coming back didn't diminish our love, Robert. It enhanced it. It showed us what we were capable of, how generous and strong and creative love can be when we don't try to constrain it with fear. Now, at 78, I live alone in the house Robert and I shared for so many years, surrounded by photographs and memories of my remarkably full life. I have pictures of my wedding to James in 1943 and pictures of my wedding to Robert in 1948. I have photos of family dinners with all 3 of us laughing together, of James teaching my grandchildren how to build tree houses, of Robert and James arguing good-naturedly about baseball statistics. People sometimes ask me how I managed such an unusual situation, how I navigated the complexities of loving 2 men without destroying my family or my marriage. The answer is simple, though not always easy. With honesty, with generosity, with a willingness to believe that love multiplies rather than divides, and with the understanding that some of life's most beautiful solutions come not from choosing between good options, but from finding ways to embrace them all. James kept his promise to come back to me, even though it took him so many years to do so. But the real miracle wasn't his return. It was discovering that love is big enough, strong enough, and creative enough to make space for everyone who truly belongs. Sometimes the most profound love story isn't about 2 people finding each other despite impossible odds. Sometimes it's about 3 people finding a way to love each other well, with wisdom and kindness, and the courage to write their own rules about what family can look like. That's the story I wanted to tell you today, dear friends. The story of how love survived war, amnesia, years of separation, and the challenge of learning to love again without letting go of what came before. Because sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, we don't have to choose between the love we've lost and the love we've found. Sometimes we get to keep both, transformed and deepened by the miracle of a heart that's big enough to hold everything that truly matters. Thank you for listening to my story. May your own love stories be blessed with the same generosity, wisdom, and beautiful complexity that made mine so rich and full and unexpectedly wonderful.